Okay, so before we get into building this application programmatically, let's go over exactly what AutoLayout is. AutoLayout is the mathematical constraint system iOS uses to dynamically layout and position its views. This is how our apps are able to render themselves with one set of definitions on a variety of differently sized screens and devices. And it works by solving a series of linear equations, much like the ones you solved in high school doing basic linear algebra and math. The only difference between AutoLayout in Interface Builder versus doing it programmatically is instead of defining the constraints visually in Interface Builder, we define them programmatically in Swift. Now, AutoLayout can look confusing and daunting at first. It's a big subject with a lot of new concepts and terms, but once you understand that so long as every view has a position, width, and height, its layout can be defined. And working with its system of anchors becomes a lot easier. And of course, the more you do it, the easier it gets. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to start by giving you lots of practice doing AutoLayout programmatically in Swift. And we're going to start by converting this design defined in Interface Builder into one that we can programmatically layout with anchors in Swift. So if you're ready, head on over to the next section and see how we can use AutoLayouts and anchors to position our controls in Swift. Hey everyone, welcome back. In this episode, we're going to start taking this lovely interface-built Weathery app over here and slowly start converting it over into Swift programmatic code. And we're going to do that using the anchoring system that AutoLayout gives us to position and size all of these elements in our apps. Before we do that though, let's just quickly review what the anchoring system is in AutoLayout and how it works. So the way AutoLayout anchors work is these are basically a system of constraints we apply to controls that we want to display and position in our views in our apps. There's 4 core main anchors we use: top, leading, trailing, bottom, which allow us to pin controls or views within our apps. We also have constraints around width and height. And we can also align things by going center Y and center X. And it's with these controls, anchors, and constraints that we can position and size anything we like however we want in our iOS apps. Now, if you've ever built an app before using Interface Builder and storyboards, you've already been doing this in your apps. By taking the controls, dragging them out into Interface Builder, and then using these controls in the bottom here, this is how you have been using and positioning anchors in your apps. You've been defining anchors like this, where basically you can set the top, leading, trailing anchor. You can activate them. You can add constraints. You can set height and width. So you've already been doing this when you've been building apps. And of course, these constraints show up over here on the left-hand side as various anchors and constraints like this in your apps. So you've probably already played with these things. You've already worked with them. Now all we're going to do is take this exact same constraint system and recreate it programmatically. And let's start by seeing if we can just reposition and lay out this location button in the upper left-hand corner here. Okay, I'll see you in the arcade. Okay, welcome to the arcade. Here's where we're going to start laying things out. Let's start with this location button in the upper left-hand corner. Let's see what steps we need to go through to add that programmatically. I'm going to flip over to my Weather View controller here, and we're going to start by going right to the very top and just first of all defining the control that we want to add. In this case, we're going to call it Location Button, and it's going to be a plain old UI button, just like that. So there, we've defined our button. Now, following the pattern we've got here, we're going to give it some style, and then we're going to lay it out. In terms of styling, we're going to do what we always do in AutoLayout and set the translate mask to be false on the control. Then we're going to set a background image on that button to be location circle fill, and then finally we'll give it a tint color. Now this is really interesting what's going on here. We're setting the background image on a button, which is fine, but look at this image that we're adding. It's called System Name Location Circle Fill. And that's something called an SF symbol. SF symbols are something that were added relatively recently into iOS. I'm running the application here, on my desktop. And what it is it's a series of symbols that are built into iOS that we can use in our applications. So for example, everything you see here is an SF symbol. This is a button. This is a magnifying glass. This is a cloud. These are all symbols built right into the operating system, so we don't actually even have to add these assets ourselves. And if you go read a little bit more about these on the internet, you'll find there's even more tools to add with the latest SF symbols too, where you can change the color, it'll dynamically react to dark mode. And these are really good things to use in our app because they resize themselves automatically. Apple's put a lot of thought into care and how they should look, and they're fully vectorized, which means they're going to expand and shrink as our accessibility views shrink and grow. So we really like using them in our apps if we can, and that's what we're going to be doing with our button here. We're going to use one called Location Circle Fill, which if you download the app and you ever want to browse or look through all the different symbols we have here, in this case, if I just type Location Circle Fill, you'll see this one come up here. This is how we access the symbol. We simply pass in the name of the string here, and that'll be loaded into our image. So that's the styling around our button. We've created the button, we've styled it. Now we get to the fun stuff. Here's where we actually use it. So to lay this out, let's go ahead and add our button, our location button, to our view. Order here matters. We want it to appear on top of background view, so we'll add it after. And then down here, we'll go ahead and start doing the actual auto layout. Now for this particular button, let's just see where it's sitting. We would like this one to appear. Let's position it right at the top. Let's give it a top anchor and a leading anchor. And let's just start with those two constraints and see what that gives us. So we can go location button, top anchor constraint is going to be equal to, I'm just going to scroll this up a bit. I would like this to be equal to the top anchor of my safe area layout guide. So let's just talk about this for a second. I'm going to pin it to the view.safe area layout guide top anchor, and that should pin that constraint right up here. Now the reason why I'm using this safe area layout guide is I don't want it to go all the way to the top like we did with our background view. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to just pin this to the left-hand side using the leading anchor. I'm going to add a very similar constraint there. And this one will just go view.leading anchor. Now if I run these with just these two constraints, that should pin it to the upper left-hand corner as it has, which is great. But watch what happens if I don't use this safe area layout guide and I just pin it to the top anchor of the view. See, now it goes right up to the top here. And that's the difference between using the view guide and the safe area layout guide. The safe area makes sure that we don't render something in here like our status bar, or if we had a tab bar at the bottom, it just keeps our controls in these safe areas, which is why it's really good to use. So I'm going to go ahead and use safe area layout guide here. And I'm even going to use it here just in case we want to go into landscape mode. Let me show you what I mean. If I put the safe area guide here, we'll now make sure that when we flip into landscape mode, that button also appears in the safe area. So that's how the safe area layout guide works. That's how we can get it positioned where we want it. But I'd also like a little bit of spacing on the left-hand side here. So how could we add that? Well, this API is really great for anchors because it's got a whole bunch of variants on how we can add padding and spacing around these things. So in the case of our leading anchor, if we want a little bit of a margin over there, what we can do is instead of just typing this equal to API, we can change it so that we use a different one called equal the spacing after with multiplier. And what this will do is this will add a little bit of padding to our leading anchor. And these multipliers are multipliers of 8 points. So by putting 1 there and running it, we'll see that the image will appear with 8 points over to the left. If I make that 3 and run it, we will now have 24 points. So this is a really nice API to use because by using these multipliers, we're using the default system spacing that Apple's already defined for us, which is really good because in case if Apple ever changed the default spacing from 8 to 16 to 4, we wouldn't have to redesign our app. It would be built in here because we're already using our multipliers. So that's what we like to use. Now, if we look at this, we can see that this is a little bit smaller than we'd like. So why don't we add, well, first of all, notice how we didn't have to add any height and width constraints. Buttons and labels have this thing that we mentioned called intrinsic content size, which means with just these two constraints, we can adequately position this button on the screen. But if we wanted to make it bigger, of course we can, and that's perfectly fine. Let's see if we can add a couple constraints to make that button a little bit wider and a little bit bigger. So the way we can do that is we go back to our location button, we add a constraint. This time it's going to be a width anchor, and we can just set a constant value here. We can go constraint is going to be equal to constant, and I'm just going to pick 40 because I happen to know that's roughly how big I'd like it to be. And then we can also add a height anchor, and we can make that constraint also equal to 40. Oh, I actually want it equal to constant, so let me just try that again. Constraint is equal to constant 40. There we go. And if we run that now, we should see that our button is a little bit wider. And voila, there we go. We've got our button position in the upper left-hand corner. Its size, it's looking pretty good. As a challenge now, why don't we see if we can get you actually adding this magnifying glass over here. Now I'll give you a hint. It's going to be very similar to what we've already done. We're going to want to add another button. Let's call this one the search button. We're going to want to give it some very basic similar styling here. Pretty much exactly what you see here, only instead of location circle fill, I'll give you a hint. The image you're going to want to use is magnifying glass. And then come down here and see if you can't add the constraints necessary to put that search button in the upper right-hand corner. Okay, I'll let you go ahead and bang your head against that for a while. Come back and we'll do it together. Okay, good luck. We'll see you in a bit. Okay, how did that go? Were you able to get the button in the upper right-hand corner? Don't worry if you won't. The stuff can be a little bit tricky at first, but I do encourage you to take a run at these design challenges as I throw them at you. They're a great way to learn before I show you the solution, and they're really going to help cement what you're learning as we go through the course. So do take a run at these things and write down any questions you've got, and hopefully we'll answer them when we go through the solution. But let's do it together. Let's go back now, and let's just repeat the process. And let's go ahead and define another button here. Let's call it search button. It's also going to be a UI button. Let's come down here and let's style it in a very similar way. I'm just going to copy the code for location, rename this search button. And instead of using that location circle fill, we're going to go ahead and use this magnifying glass. Whoops. Okay. Oh, I typed search button. I want that to be a search button. There we go. And now let's go down and let's actually lay this out. So just like we did before, it's going to be very similar, but let's just go through what we want to do here. We'd like the button to appear on the safe area, the top anchor, but this time we're going to put it on the trailing side. So let's add those two constraints first. So we're going to go search button, top anchor, give us some space here, is going to be equal to, top anchor is going to be equal to the constraint of the views safe area layout guide dot top anchor. Okay, so that's going to pin us to the top. Now to get over on the right or the trailing side, let's now add that. So let's take our search button trailing anchor and let's go and say its constraint will be equal to the views trailing anchor like this. Now I'm just going to run this, and well, actually while we're here, why don't we go ahead and add the width and height also. I'm just going to copy these just to make this a little bit quicker. Let's go ahead and run that and just see what that does for us. Okay, so we've got the top, we've got the trailing, boom, it blew up. Why did it blow up? Well, if we look down here, it says unable to activate constraint with anchors, and I think I know why. One of the things I forgot, and maybe you forgot to do this when you were doing it on yours too, I forgot to add the button to the view. And I always seem to do this. It's just a common thing. Don't worry if this happens to you. It happens to all of us. We can't add constraints between views and buttons until they're in the same super view together. So we've got to get them all lined up. So until we add the search button to the view, none of these constraints will work. And that's what that error message was showing us. Okay, but now we've got that in there. Let's run this again and see what it does for us. Great. Okay, we've got our location, we've got our magnifying glass. It'd be nice if there's a little bit of spacing there. Let's go ahead and see if we can't do that. I think there's another API here where we can add a constant. And what this will do is this will add a little bit of a space to wherever we've lined these things up. And I'm just going to use the spacing of 8. And I'm going to run this. We'll just see what this looks like. Okay, almost, but not quite. What it's done is it's actually pulled it a little bit too far to the right. It's actually treated this thing as a negative, where I really wanted the padding to go the other way, this way, as a positive. So we can fix that by making that -8, running it again, and there. Now we've brought it in more to where we like it. So that's one way we can set trailing constraints. Sometimes you just have to remember these things can be negative, and that's just something to look out for. But I want to show you another way of adding this trailing constraint, one that's a little more elegant and more in line with Apple's API. They have another API here for trailing constraints, and it's called equal the system spacing after. And what it means is you can type out, you can flip the order and start with your views anchor. So in this case, I'm going to go view trailing anchor. I'd like to add a constraint here of one called equal to system spacing after multiplier, much like the one we used up here, but in this case, it's with the view and the button. So if we just select that one here, we're going to basically take the views trailing anchor and say, I'd like the system spacing after it to be tied to our search button, trailing anchor, and we'll have a multiplier of 1. So this is just another way of typing this constraint that we had down below. And if we run that, we'll see we get the same result. It's still brought over there, but this is just a built-in API that just reads really nice. You just have to remember to swap the ordering. Instead of going your control and then the view, here we go view and then control, and it's just because of the ordering of this. It reads better if you go the view is going to be equal to the system spacing after the search button, which is what we've got here. So there's a couple of different ways to do this. You've got a couple of APIs to play with. I kind of like this system spacing one, but sometimes I do use the constant. But I just wanted you to see both of those to see how those work. All right, so let's continue. Let's add this search bar at the top. Let's go back into our controls. Let's add a search text field, and this is going to be a UI text field. And then following the exact same pattern we had before, we'll come down and add some styling. The styling, which normally if we were working with Interface Builder would be defined there, is now of course going to be defined in code. So we're going to set our mask to be false in order to do auto layout. We'll then give it a font. We'll put some placeholder search text in there. We'll give it an alignment, a border style, and a background color of system fill. And that should style that nicely for us. Let's not forget to add the search text field to our views. Otherwise, none of the constraints will work. And let's just think about what we want to do here. So we've got a button on the left, a button on the right. Everything is nicely positioned. We'd like a search bar to go between those. So in order to lay those out, let's see if we can put the search bar in here and we'll have the search bar's leading anchor come after the location buttons trailing. And then we'll have the search bar's trailing anchor come just before the search magnifying glass leading. Let's see if we can just position that in there and get it laying out something like this. Okay, so if we come in here, let's start with the search bar's, the text field, that leading, let's grab its leading anchor. So that leading anchor, we'd like to be a constraint equal to the system spacing after the location button dot trailing anchor. And we'll give it a spacing of 1. So what that constraint is we've just added this right here. The search text field leading is going to be equal to the system spacing after the location trailing. That's that guy there. Now let's go to the other side and add this one. So in this case, I'm going to flip it. I want the search button's leading anchor to be equal to the system spacing after the search text field's trailing anchor. And I'll also use a multiplier of 1. So that should define that here. So we've got the left, we've got the right. To really fully lay this out, we also need a top. So why don't we also, usually I start with the top, but I just start with the leadings here. Let's make a constraint. Let's put this to the top, just like we did the other one with the safe area layout guide. So we'll go search field top anchor. We will have a constraint there, and we'll just set it directly equal to the views safe area layout guide, its top anchor, just like that. And let's run this and see what this gives us. Okay, so we'll take a look. Hey, not bad. We've got our buttons fully laid out, the text bar is nicely lined, and things are looking pretty good. Now we could continue building this design, adding constraints, working through these other buttons, labels, and just fully building the applications, adding constraints, lining things up, and that's a perfectly valid way to build an app. But there is one neat little trick, and something that's used quite a bit when programmatically laying out designs like this, is to leverage something called the stack view. So if we look at the original design here, you'll see that the way they did it in Interface Builder was they added their buttons here. They've got their text fields and things like this, but they're all sitting within something called the stack view. And in the next section, we're going to take a look at how to leverage the stack view so that we can minimize the number of constraints we have to add, because it turns out the stack view does a lot of magic and really nice aligning and positioning for us. So if you're up for that, come on over to the next episode and we'll jump in and we'll take a look at how to add stack views to our layout. Okay, we'll see you there.